Thank you. No, I've got a mic already. Okay. You better remove that so that we don't avoid the feedback. Thank you very much. Temba is a very good friend of mine. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, I come here and I stand in front of you, not just as an African, but a black Zimbabwean who is a neighbor and a friend, and my intentions are noble, and I mean well. Now, I know in Zimbabwe we have a saying, "Akuruma nzeve wako." In short, it means one who warns you in advance is your friend. Now, hear me out. I'm not naive about the history of displacement. I've read a lot about Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. I know a lot about the Group Areas Act of 1950, the 1890 movement of the pioneer column to Rhodesia, and the brutality that the colonial regimes inflicted on our forefathers, the Land Apportionment Act, and so forth. Yes, I'm well aware that the colonial regimes were very insensitive by displacing us from our central lands. But the question that lingers in my mind, having witnessed over 200 years of civilization in this part of the world in Southern Africa, are we prepared to open another chapter of confrontation, of land confrontation? Do we want to behave exactly like the same people, those people that behaved in this despicable manner 200 years ago? The same people that we accuse of having been barbaric, but we want to follow the same path of darkness and barbarism. We are not like them. We are different from them because we are now civilized. And this is why we should take lessons from history. But something really bothers me about us Africans, black or white or Indian. We never seem to learn from history. I don't know whether it is in our DNA or perhaps we are simply overwhelmed by populist politics. You know, the African nationalists and the post-colonial governments have since the 1950s copied word for word this script of self-immolation. Today we are here debating expropriation without compensation and its possible negative effects on South Africa. And I feel Nelson Mandela must be turning in his grave. You know, he commented authoritatively about the situation in Zimbabwe, although he was obviously castigated by Robert Mugabe, and said that some of the policies that the Zimbabwe government propagate, they show a deficiency of leadership. Is that the kind of deficiency of leadership that we are going to be talking about once this policy of expropriation is inflicted on this beautiful nation of South Africa? I mean, Julius Nyerere himself once said that Zimbabwe was a jewel of Africa. And I wonder what he must be saying to himself if that jewel now is a basket case. South Africa had been privileged to occupy the front seat and watch Zimbabwe across the border tear itself to pieces. The African National Congress and the EFF and all the proponents of EWC, I urge them to take a back step and lean back in their comfort zones and ask themselves what kind of good land reform policy could cause such suffering, so much hatred, so much bitterness, only for one section of a community, of a country, of a citizenry. Why does a country want to adopt a policy, a law, that would attract so much retribution from the international community? And the answer is very simple. two wrongs can never make a right. Any policy that seeks revenge, that leaves a nation in a state of irreversible despair, cannot be by any means justifiable. A piece of legislation, even legitimized through constitutional reform, that not only violates property rights, but also transfers national endowments to a small ruling elite, a privileged few, is a recipe for disaster. And this is exactly what is going to happen, because governments are not run by saints, they are run by human beings. So fate had been good to South Africa by making this country watch this trend of destruction unfold from across the border. Of course, one can present feeble arguments that you will not do it as bad as we did, but when a man jumps out of a moving aeroplane without a parachute, there's only one result. And if you stand and do the same and think you're going to do it right, the result will be the same. So, my friends, this is the whole moral behind my presentation. Even given an opportunity to stand to state my case, whether it is television, whether it is radio, whether it is social networks, I will say the same message, that if South Africa follows the same path that Zimbabwe took, it is a path to self-destruction, because we experienced it in Zimbabwe from year 2000 onwards. Of course, there are those who say that land reform Themba has been successful, and I cannot blame them, because in a democracy, all manner of opinion is allowed. But you know, you cannot measure success of land reform on the basis of expanded deliveries of tobacco, because you choose to ignore the large-scale destruction of forests. You choose to ignore the decimation of employment opportunities of the very same sector that you seem to want to protect. You ignore the gross violations of both property and human rights. And above all, you choose to ignore the erosion of the very factor of Ubuntu that brings Africans and people together. Because a nation remains bitter, a nation remains angry, and this is not good for Africa. So we need not to confuse the land reform settlement programs that were run in the 1980s, that were based on consensus, and as Leon said, of measuring value with Mugabe's chaotic land reform, because it was not land reform, it was land deformation. Even evidence exists of how large-scale production in commercial farms created inextricable links between agriculture and industry. This is why we have always been told that Zimbabwe is agro-based. The value chains that has been decimated by populist agrarian reform. Now, I wonder, what are the real milestones of success that the protagonists and the purveyors of EWC narratives will be using in future? There is strong evidence that agriculture is one of the biggest employers, even across the border in Zimbabwe. It was. I know that the Lakenshouse Agreement perpetuated white land ownership and privilege. But I still insist that the sanctity of property rights gave the country, our country, my country, Zimbabwe, an opportunity to strengthen its industrial base. But today, the flight of capital, the hemorrhage of citizenry, is substantiated by the numbers of Zimbabweans that are in exile. How is it that if these reform policies had been successful, there are 3 million Zimbabweans in exile in South Africa? How is it that a nation which was once a producer of food and exporting food, how is it that today, as we spend here, we're importing onions, we're importing soybeans, we're importing wheat in a country that was once a SADC exporter of products? The National Railways of Zimbabwe, which used to carry coal to the commercial farming areas is almost defunct. Now, this is because we did not heed to advice. I know that economists have had different opinions about this, but one economist once said that in Zimbabwe today, nobody feels safe when the state can authorize itself to take people's property. This country will recover fast if government promises to respect property rights and revive the rule of law. This is exactly what the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, is attempting to do, to try and present this facade of normalcy by inviting the former commercial farmers. But I guess now it's a little too late. Because vesting property ownership and control of land in the hands of the state does, in fact, destroy the land market. I know that the proponents and purveyors of EWC narrative will argue that once embedded in the Constitution, expropriation must be honorable. But my point of departure with this narrative is that there are good and bad laws. Any law that is open to abuse by central government, any statute that ultimately benefits a small ruling elite must surely be a bad law. And that is exactly the whole paradigm behind our condemnation of apartheid. A bad policy has got bad results. I'm sure you can remember Professor Steve Hanke writing on many occasions about our $1 trillion inflation. Why? Because the Mugabe regime was isolated and it was treated as like a property rights abuse pariah state. So Mugabe concocted new ways of financing the budget deficit. There was a massive flight of capital. So you can see that by just tampering around with one element of property rights, the domino effect is devastating. There was a semblance of sanity, of course, when the opposition-inspired GNU came into power briefly, but by then it was too late. I therefore want to know, how will South Africa stem the tide of global financial anger if EWC is legitimized? My question is that, are you ready as South Africans? Let alone, are you aware of the devastating consequences to your monetary, fiscal, and trade state of the affairs? Listening to Julius Malema and Cyril Ramaphosa, you're obviously not ready, or you're in a state of denial. Let me conclude, Themba. Do not be fooled by the extremist groups who claim EWC can be done so well as to immunize South Africa from being Zimbabweanized. Mugabe did not embark on land expropriation and invasion to empower us black Zimbabweans. It was political expediency for himself and his cronies. As researcher Paul Palmer once put it, in 1989, with an election due the following year, there were votes to be won. 2019, right? And the government desperately needed an issue on which it could try to regain some semblance of popularity. So when a policy is driven by populism, when a policy is driven by political expediency, it is not a good policy. Therefore, South Africa today, I want you to consider these two questions as I close. Are you sure, as you would say in Zulu, are you convinced, South Africans, including you, yes, that EWC will extricate your people from the poverty trap given the existing evidence to the contrary? The empirical evidence that is clear from across the border. If EWC is meant to empower the bulk of the black South Africans, are you sure that is going to happen? Can you not take lessons from Zimbabwe, the 1980s experience of how land resettlement no matter how slow, can be done without leaving a trail of destruction, bitterness, and revenge. Fate has been kind to you, Abantu South Africa, the people of South Africa. You have been shown in advance how reckless land policies can destroy a once thriving nation, the jewel of Africa, which was Zimbabwe. EWC, like Mugabe's first land invasions, is not just a blatant violation of property rights. It is also a recipe for poverty. It is a recipe for hatred. And it is a recipe for negative global attention. I hope 10 years from now, we are going to remember me as the African from across the border who once warned you and you never listened. Ngiyalibonga. Thank you.